Good Tov, Baruch Hashem. His daf yomi is Menachos daf nun chet Menachos 58, and we're going to start Be'ezras Hashem Yisbarach on the bottom of nun Zayin Amabez, 8 lines on the bottom. The Gemara had said in yesterday's daf that if a person brought a korban, brought on the mizbeach something that was not supposed to go on the mizbeach, when the other parts of that korban went on the mizbeach, then you're in violation of a prohibition of the Torah of Baal of Saktiru Mimenu Ishel Hashem. So it's a prohibition called Baal Taktiru. So today's daf, the Gemara wants to know if you're in violation of this daf, even if you just of this lav, even if you don't actually burn it, even if they don't actually burn it, but you just put it onto the ramp. Imar, we learned Hamala Mikulam Agabi Akevech. Let's say you place from all of these items on the ramp. You don't actually put them on the mizbeach. So in this context, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev, Rabbi Lazar Amar Potter. So even that, Rabbi Yochanan says you're liable, whereas Rabbi Lazar says you're Potter. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev, the Tanya mizbeach. It says in the pasuk, it says Karban Reshis Tekrivu Samu Hashem. Now mizbeach or Yahu, they can't go up on the altar. Eli Elam mizbeach kevesh minayin. How do I know this includes the ramp? So the reason why I know it includes the ramp, Tamomar ve'al mizbeach lo ya'alu. It says to the altar, you're not allowed to bring it up. And when it says mizbeach lo ya'alu, it implies that you can't even bring it up on the ramp. Rabbi Lazar Amar Potter, he says you're exempt. My time on across Seor Udvash. The pasuk says that Seor called Vash lo saktiru, and the other pasuk says Karban Reshis Tekrivu Osam. And then it says, with respect to the Bikurim, it says, the Korban Reishis, you shall bring them to Hashem. Now, Mizbeach or Yahweh, Osam hu de Rabbi Ochod, de Rabbi Och Kevesh Mizbeach. With respect to the prohibition of bringing the Seor and the Dvash, there's a prohibition even on the ramp. Osam, with respect to that context, but with respect to, in general, those things that are not supposed to go on the altar, then you're only liable if it's on the mizbech. So, but not other matters. So now on the top of Nun Chesed and Aleph, Rabbi Yochanan, Hi Osam, my Avidle. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with this word Osam, which Rabbi Lazar had said it means that there's only a prohibition of Baal Saktiru on the ramp by the Seor and Devash, by sourdough and Devash. So what does Rabbi Yochanan do with it? Tanya. He used it for the following brisa. Yachol yehi yachid misnadev umevi kayotzi banudava. I might think that a yachid, an individual, can volunteer to bring Seor and Devash on the altar, a voluntary offering, just as a vow. Even though Seor and Devash are prohibited, I might think just like he can bring it as a voluntary offering. And I think it's a valid vow. So it says, only when it's the bikurim can you bring only at that moment in the context of the bikurim. So it says korban reishis takrivu about the shtei alachem. That's where it says you should bring it. Only an individual can bring, only a community can bring it, and not an individual. Only the community can bring the shtei alachem, not the individual. Yachid maybe she'ini maybe chovas. Okay, Yotziba. On top of Nun Chesam and Aleph 58a at the top, I might think an individual could not bring the shtei alachem because he's never obligated to bring it. Aval tzibor maybe, but I might think that if the community wants to bring a voluntary shtei alechem, which is chametz, that they could bring it. But aval tzibor maybe, maybe chavos because they sometimes do it. Tamalomar osam. No, it says osam, meaning to say only in those cases of the shtei alechem are you allowed to bring it on the altar. That's what the community can bring, but they can't bring the shtei lechem as a voluntary offering. And what is the obligation to bring? The obligation is to bring shtei lechem min haseor, ubikurim min advash. So that's what you're obligated to bring. You're obligated to bring the 2 loaves of bread from the seor, that's chametz, and bikurim comes from the dvash, comes from the fruit. So the Gemara asks the question: is it really the case that the 2 loaves of bread cannot be brought as a voluntary offering? The Gemara cites a brisa, and this brisa, at the end of this brisa, they're going to ask this question: isn't it the case that you can bring the 2 loaves of bread as a voluntary offering? And how do we prove that? Because Tanya, it says in the brisa, if nemar kol saor, it says in the pasuk, it says kol saor v'chol davash lo saktiru. There's all the chametz and all the honey you're not allowed to bring as an offering to Hashem. So why does it have to say the word kol by both seor and devash, by both chametz and honey? Im nemar kol seor, lama nemar kol devash, im nemar kol devash, lama nemar kol seor. Why does it have to say kol by both? So the Gemara explains, the Brisa says, in yesh b'seor, mashem devash, yesh b'devash, mashem b'seor. Each have a unique character trait. So hor hutar mikol b'mikdash. Now, there is a time where seor is allowed to be brought in the temple. That's the 2 loaves of bread and the korban todah. Devash lo hutar mikol b'mikdash, but the devash is never allowed to go up as a korban. Devash hutar b'shiar menachos, but the devash, the honey, is allowed to be mixed in with the shirayim of the menachos. After you bring the kometz and you have some bread there, matzah there, you can mix it in with the honey and make a nice little honey sandwich. That's okay. It doesn't make it chametz. But even after the chametz is brought, you can't put the soor with it to make it chametz. So the Gemara says, wait, or there's the Brisa still speaking. For this reason, they need to say kol seor, kol devash. So now that's why it says kol seor and kol devash. So the Gemara asks, excuse me. So now the Gemara says, okay, so we have a case where there's a seor dehutar mikol b'mikdash my niu. What is the case where the seor is allowed in the temple? Isn't it referring to where are you allowed to bring it? Meaning not say where you're obligated to bring it, but where you're allowed to bring it. Isn't it the 2 loaves of bread that the community can voluntarily offer? And we see from here that there is a case where the 2 loaves are permitted. That the korban dava. So Amrav Amram. No. Well, we karev imayim. No, it doesn't refer to the price is not saying, because the reason why, excuse me, I should have clarified this point. When it says that there's a time where the 2 loaves of bread are hutar, they're allowed to be brought, it means that they go up on the mizbeach. But where do they go up on the mizbeach? Because the 2 loaves of bread are not actually offered on the mizbeach. So doesn't it mean that they can be brought up as the mizbeach as a voluntary offering? And the Gemara says, no, it's not referring to the 2 loaves of bread themselves going on the mizbeach, but it's referring to the 2 sheep, the shalmei atzeres, that are brought with them. We karvi mayim. The Gemara says, Iachi bikurim nami. The bikurim also then are hutar mikwalo, because they also go up on the altar. Because what goes up on the altar, not the fruits themselves, but hagozolos shal gabi asawan ayu olos. The birds that they used to bring with their baskets when they did the Bikurim ceremony, they would bring baskets of fruit with them. Vasam shabiyadan nitan kohanim, and also the baskets would be given to the kohanim, and that would also be, I guess that's meaning that's like a kind of offering. The Gemara in Baba Kama 92a tells us that the Bikurim ceremony was an example of where poverty follows the poor. And that's because the wealthy people and the poor people would both bring their fruits in baskets, but the poor people would bring it in wicker baskets, and the wealthy people would bring it in silver baskets. So it's you can imagine it's like a Tupperware. The Cohen would take the wicker basket from the poor man and say he doesn't want such a little wickery thing back, and I'll keep it. Whereas the silver thing, he'll return to the wealthy. And that's why the Gemara says this is an example of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. But anyway, we see from here that the Bikurim ceremony, if you're saying that that's Huter Miklolo, then they also are Huter Miklolo because the birds that were accompanying the baskets could be brought. So the Gemara says, no, those were not actually karbanos. Hanu atar Bikurim Mudasu. They were not actually karbanos. There's no obligation to bring them, but that's just a way of making the Bikurim more beautiful. So we don't find that there's something actually brought with it. This is a little bit of a difficulty because Rashi says in Mesechas Bikurim, it says that the Bikurim te'unin karban, that there was a carbon that was required to be brought with it. And the Gemara Yerushalmi says this was a carbon shlamim. So therefore, it wasn't considered like they were so connected that it had to be brought or else it would be disqualifying. It was just something that was brought along with it. It was not obligated to be brought. You're allowed to bring it another time. And so therefore, it's not considered something that is hutar miklolo. By Rami Barachama mi Rav Chisda. So Rami Barachama answered Rav Chisda, so again, we're talking about the prohibition of Baal Taktira that you're not allowed to bring as a carbon something that was you're not allowed to burn on the altar something that was not supposed to be burned. Let's say you bring the meat of the carbon chatas now, and how do we know if it's within that category? If other parts of the carbon are supposed to be burned, and this part and is not supposed to be burned, then you can bring it as offering, and if you do, you're chayiv. So what about if you bring up the meat of the chatas ofal gabam mizbeach? What will be the law? Do we say kol shemim menu ishim amarachmana? Nothing from this was burned. Nothing from the chatas ofal was burned on the altar. And so therefore, maybe you're not in violation if you burn the meat, because there's no parts that was supposed to be burned. Or Dilma kol sheshmo carbon. Or maybe since it's called a carbon, there, if you burn any part of it that wasn't supposed to be burned, you're going to be chayev. Mahayna mishmo carbon. Amarlei, so Rav Chisda responds to Rami Barchama. Amarlei, he responds, kol sheshmo carbon. Mahayna mishmo carbon. He says anything which is called a carbon, and this is called a carbon, so therefore you're a chayiv. The Gemara says, well, actually, it's a machok. It's ketanai. Rabbi Eliezer, Omar kol shemi menu ishim. He says anything that's actually burnt, and so therefore you want to be chayiv here. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says kol sheshmo carbon. Anything that's called a carbon, therefore you be chayiv here. Mai binayu. What is the distinction between them? Amar Rav Chisda basar chatasa of ika benayu. Rav Chisda says the meat of the chatas ha'of is a distinction between them, meaning to say that according to Rabbi Akiva, you be chayev, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, you be pater. Rav Amar lug shemen shamatzora ika b'nei. Rav says it's the oil of the mitzora, which Rashi explains nothing from it was burnt, but it's called a carbon, like we say in Menachos, we call karbanam rabbas lug shemen shamatzora. And if you're going to ask, Rashi says, but there is something that's brought with it because the Asher Mitzvah comes with it. That's not a difficulty because it's not completely connected. Because you can bring the Asham now and the Lug 10 days later. Anyway, so according to Rabbi Kiva, you'd be liable. According to Rabbi Eliezer, you'd be pater by the Lug Shem and Shamatzorah. Okay. And now the Gemara says, Tanam Banam Seor Val Taktiru. That, oh, wait, we have a different girsa. Seor, Tanam Banam, it says, Seor, you're not allowed to bring. Eli Ella Kuo. I only know that you're liable if you bring the entire amount of the Seor. Miktaso Minayin. How do I know if you just do a portion of it, you're also chayiv? Talmud kol. It says kol seor. A ruvo minayin. How do I know if there's a mixture of the seor with something else? You're also chayiv. Talmud ki kol, because it says ki kol. So my kamar. What is this price is saying? Two interpretations. Abaye and Rava. Amar Abaye achik Amar. Seor bal taktiru. If you bring the seor on the mizbech, you're liable for bal taktiru. In liela kazayis. I only might think you're liable if you bring an olive size amount of seor on the mizbech. Chatzi size minayin. How do I know if you bring a half an olive size amount on the mizbech, you're also chayev? Tamomar kol a kol. So kol, even if you bring just a half an olive size amount, you're chayev. A ruvo minayin. How do I know if you bring a mixture of the seor with matzah, you're also chayev? Talmud ki kol, because it says ki kol. So therefore, you're liable for the olive size, half a size, olive size, and even an eruvo. Rava Amar Hachikamer. No, this is what the Bryce is saying. Seor bal taktiru, that if you do this or you're in violation of bal taktiru, eli ela kometz. I might think you're only liable if you do a full scoop. Chatzi kometz. Let's say do a half a scoop of seor minayin. Talmud lomar. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says kol. Eruvo minayin. How do I know if it's a mixture? Omar minayin tam omar ki kol. So the Micah, what's the dispute between Abaye and Rava? We'll break it down. Abaye says you're liable for a shear or for half a shear, and Rava says you're liable for a kometz or half a kometz. So what is the dispute between them? Abaye saver yesh kometz pachos mishnei zeisim. Abaye says that you can have a kometz less than 2 olives. And so therefore, look at Rashi. When Abaye says you're liable if you do, from the first pasuk, if you do the shear, you need to do the full amount. And so therefore, since there's a kometz that can be done less than 2 olives, Ashminan, therefore it's coming to teach us Kol Yisera Diye Shaktara Pchusa Mikizayis. Anything that's more that there's Aktara less than a Kizayis. So it's teaching us Ashminan Kol, it's teaching us this idea of the Yesh Aktara Pchusa Mikizayis. Hold on 1 second. The overlap, and this is what it means in the comments. Sheyesh aktara. Continue to Rashi. Yesh aktara bepachos mikazayis inyan hechsher aktara. With respect to the hechsher aktara, kamosha amru kan the inyan iser aktara sohar v'kach nemer shama mishnah. So therefore, again, what is Abaye saying? Abaye is of the position that there is a kometz that can be brought less than 2 olives amount. And so therefore, if it's one olive size amount, it will be a kosher kmitza. And so therefore, he says that the Tana is saying that from the word kol, we learn yesh haktara pekusa mikazayis, that after haktara is prohibited, it's also coming to teach us even if it's less than the kazayis. And Rava says, ein kometz pachos mishnei zaysim. And Rava says, no, the kometz has to be at least 2 olives. And so from the word kol, he's teaching us that the Torah is saying a half a kometz, which has a kazayis, is also prohibited. But ein haktara pekusa mikazayis. But it has to be a minimum of a kazayis. So this is a dispute we already had earlier in our Gemara. Actually, we had it back on Daf Chavav. So now we have another concept here. How many prohibitions, if you do offer this on the altar, how would you be liable for lashes? So let's say you bring the honey and the sourdough and the honey on the altar. Amarava loke mishum sor v'loke mishum dvash v'loke mishum eruvi sor u'mishum eruvi dvash. Rava says that you're going to be liable 4 sets of lashes. One for the chametz, one for the honey, one for the mixture of chametz and matzah, and one for the mixture of honey. But Abaye says, ein loken alav shabakos. Abaye says, you're not going to get lashes for what we call this case called lav shabakos. What is a lav shabakos? Look at the Rashi. That the kol sa'or, kol davash, lo saktiru is a lav shabakos. Because why is it called a prohibition that includes multiple things? Because we learned from this prohibition of lo saktiru, shnei isurim, 2 prohibitions. Isurei haktara ve isur haktares v'haktara shel sa'or. The prohibition of bringing sourdough, chametz, and the prohibition of them mixing it. And lo saktiru ulav shabakos. And we also learn out the concept of you cannot offer the honey. And so shenishma menu shnei isurim. Isur haktares devash. V'haktares and the mixture. So since the prohibition includes more than one, since the words include more than one prohibition, it's called it's going to be called a lav shabakos, and you don't get lashes. And Rashi continues, avo ilav kol, if it had not been kol, then mishum seor dvash kasav chabazaras achas lo mikre lav shabakos. So Rashi then clarifies the word kol is what's calling it to be called a lav shabakos. But anyway, Abaye says this is a lav shabakos, and so therefore you don't get lashes for every single one. Now, but do you get any lashes? Ika da amri chada mialaki. So there are some say that he doesn't get 2 lashes for kol sa'or. But he would get midin seor okay, but he would get 1. He wouldn't get 2 for the prohibition of seor and the prohibition of the eruvin, but he would get at least 1. V'ika da'amri afilu chada nami ika da'amri chada nami lo lucky. Ika da'amri chada mi lucky. V'ika da'amri chada nami lo lucky. The other one says he wouldn't even get 1 lashes. Because this prohibition is not like what we say the lav of lo sachsom. And so since it's not like that, where it's one specific prohibition followed by an action, and so therefore you're not going to get any lashes according to that approach. Well, this is today's daf. Baruch Hashem, we'll stop here and pick this up.